Mamed Khalidov versus Gegard Mousasi needs to be the main event for KSW 100. Now, this is a fight that I wanted to see for a long time. Back on New Year's Eve 2022, Bellator and Rizin did a co-promotion where they had Bellator versus Rizin, where they got 5 of the top guys from Rizin to fight against 5 of the top guys from Bellator. And although Bellator dominated and won 5-0 in those head-to-head matchups, it was pretty successful, and it got a lot of people talking and a lot of people excited about other shows that Bellator could do a co-promotion with. And one of those shows that a lot of people were saying, hey, I want to see Bellator co-promote with these guys, that show was KSW. And I said back then that the main event for a Bellator versus KSW show should be Gegard Mousasi versus Mamed Khalidov. And of course, there would have been other fights on that card. You could have had Phil DeVries versus Ryan Bader, Saladin Parnasse versus Patricio Pitbull, and then you could have had other interesting, fun super fights like Michal Materla versus Lorenz Larkin. There could have been a lot of different fights on there. Champion versus champion super fights, and then just fun super fights between highly ranked guys in their respective promotions. So that could have been a lot of fun. Unfortunately, Bellator ended up getting sold to PFL, and Scott Coker is no longer running Bellator, so that idea went out the window. Now, because PFL bought Bellator and PFL/Bellator has parted ways with Gegard Mousasi, now's the perfect time to put this fight together. Okay, we're not getting Bellator versus KSW, but we're still getting what I said should have been the main event for a KSW versus Bellator show, which is Mamed Khalidov versus Gegard Mousasi. This is a fight I've wanted to see for a long time. This is a fight I think is a great matchup. This is a fight between two highly skilled, longtime veterans of the sport, two guys who are good on the ground, good standing up. I think it'll be an excellent matchup, and I think that this is the fight that is worthy of being the headliner for KSW 100. You have Mamed Khalidov, who has headlined some of the biggest shows in the history of KSW, and outside of Michal Materla, Mamed Khalidov has been with KSW the longest. He made his KSW debut at KSW 7. One show prior to that, Michal Materla made his KSW debut at KSW 6, where he won the middleweight tournament. But it's just a one-show difference. So Mamed Khalidov is the second longest reigning guy, but basically they've been around KSW the same amount of time. So you have this guy who's been around a very long time, is a huge name in Poland, is a massive star, a legend of the sport, and he's a guy who has headlined a lot of their most historical events. The 2 Coliseum shows, first at KSW 39 and then recently at KSW 83. He also headlined the first time that KSW did a show in a cage. For a long time, they did shows in a boxing ring or a pro wrestling ring, however you want to describe it. For a long time, they did shows in the ring, and then they changed over and then started doing shows in a cage. And of course, they've done a show in a cage for a very long time now. But the first show they did a cage in was KSW 27, and that was Mamed Khalidov versus Michael Falcao in the main event. So, and of course, there's been other historical KSW events that Mamed's been a part of, and also there's been historic KSW events that Mamed hasn't been a part of. He's main evented a majority of their biggest shows, but he is their biggest star. He's been loyal to the company. There's many times over the years that he could have went to the UFC, went to Strikeforce, went to Bellator, went to a different show, and he decided to stay loyal to KSW. So I think it's only fitting that KSW puts him in this KSW 100 main event slot. And he needs a big fight, and Mousasi, because of everything that's went down with Bellator and PFL, and he parted ways with them, this is a recognizable name to a lot of people, regardless of what happened to him recently. But now more than ever, his name was back in headlines because he parted ways with Bellator/PFL. So now the fight, it made sense 2 years ago when I first said, hey, if Bellator and KSW ever did a co-promotion, this should be the main event. Now it makes even more sense. And we need Mamed in fun fights. We don't need him in these kind of fights that a lot of promotions do where it'll be the old lion versus the young lion. Can this guy who's been around the game for a long time, been very successful, been champion, been a top draw for us, can this guy maintain his spot, and can this new guy who we think is going to be the next superstar in our promotion, the next champion in our promotion, bring this guy in and see these two guys fight, this old lion versus young lion fight that we've seen countless times in basically every promotion in this sport that you can think of. We don't need any of that. We need fun fights. We need guys with recognizable names fighting against Mamed. We don't need to see him fight against the next generation. We don't need to see him try to make another run at the title. He's been there and done that. We need to see these fun fights. We need to see fights that should have happened a long time ago against guys with recognizable names. Gegard Mousasi, I think, is the best fight to headline KSW 100, but it's not the only fight that I'm willing to see. I would be interested in seeing Mamed Khalidov fight Gegard Mousasi, obviously. I'd also be interested in seeing him fight Luke Rockhold, Jacare, Hector Lombard, or Alexander Shlemenko. Those 5 guys are the guys who I really think Mamed needs to fight. I say have Mamed fight Gegard Mousasi at KSW 100, then have him fight the other 4 guys. And regardless of what happens in these fights, win, lose, or draw, have him fight these 5 fights and then have him ride off into the sunset and retire. Those are the fights that I want to see him in. I want to see him in fights against veteran guys with recognizable names in fights that should have happened a long time ago. Now, you'll notice some things about the guys I just mentioned in the list of guys I want to see Mamed fight. The reason why I named those guys off is because those are the guys who were on top. Those are the guys who were the champions of other promotions that weren't the UFC, and also were promotions that wanted Mamed back in the day. So at one point in time, Strikeforce really wanted to sign him, and Bellator back way before. We're talking about KSW versus Bellator circa 2022, 2023. I'm talking about back in like 2011, 2012, they wanted him. They wanted him to fight against Hector Lombard when Hector Lombard was the champion in Bellator under Bjorn Rebney. This predates Scott Coker. They wanted Mamed to fight against Hector Lombard either in the non-tournament super fight, which was basically just a way to keep the current champion active while the Bellator 8-man tournament to determine the number 1 contender was going on. So there were times where Hector Lombard fought against KSW veteran Jay Silva. He also fought against Falnico Vitali. He fought against Herbert Whisper Goodman. He fought a bunch of guys, Trevor Prangley. He fought a bunch of guys in these non-tournament super fights so he could stay active, non-title fight, but fighting against a guy with a recognizable name and a veteran of the sport, a skilled guy, but not a guy who they would be interested in putting in the tournament. Now, of course, if that guy were to beat the champion, like Travis View beat Christian Mpumbu, then that guy would get a spot in the next 8-man tournament to determine the number 1 contender. But while those tournaments went on, Bellator needed to come up with a way, okay, well, we can't have a title fight because our whole thing is you have to win the tournament to become the number 1 contender. So we have to figure out a way to keep our champions active while waiting for this tournament to end. So they came up with these non-title super fights, and at one point in time they were discussing, hey, let's have Mamed Khalidov, this guy who's over in KSW. He's also fought in Japan and he beat George Santiago, but he's fighting in KSW and he's dominating. He's their light heavyweight champion who recently moved down to middleweight. Let's have these guys fight. And of course, Mamed decided not to do that. And then Bellator came back and said, hey, well, if you're not interested in fighting in the non-title super fight, how about you come back and fight in the next middleweight tournament? Be one of the 8 guys fighting to be the number 1 contender. And he said no again. So that's why I mentioned Hector Lombard and Alexander Shlemenko, because after Hector Lombard vacated the title when he signed with the UFC, the next champion in Bellator was Alexander Shlemenko. He won the vacant title and then was champion. I've wanted to see Mamed Khalidov fight against Alexander Shlemenko forever, way before Bellator. back in the Elite XC days, I wanted to see this fight. Mamed Khalidov and Alexander Shlemenko fought at the last ever Elite XC event. Contrary to popular belief, Elite XC lived on past Elite XC Heat, which was supposed to be Ken Shamrock versus Kimbo Slice, which ended up getting changed to Seth Petrozelli versus Kimbo Slice, and then, of course, Kimbo Slice lost. But Elite XC did live on after that event. They lived on for one more week. Show XC, the Elite XC Challenger Series, it was Dave Herman versus Kerry Shaw in the main event, but the co-main event was Mamed Khalidov versus Jason Guida, and then another fight on that card was Alexander Shlemenko versus Bubba McDaniel. Now, Mamed Khalidov fought at 205 back in those days, and he fought Jason Guida at light heavyweight. Alexander Shlemenko was fighting at middleweight against Bubba McDaniel, but Mamed Khalidov should have always been fighting at middleweight. He was always a small 205er. So I always thought that those two guys, a fight between those two guys would be a great fight. So I wanted to see that fight forever. So if KSW said, hey, we're not going to do Gegard Mousasi versus Mamed Khalidov, we're going to do Mamed Khalidov versus Alexander Shlemenko, take all my money. I wanted to see this fight forever. And on the Strikeforce side of things, back when Mamed was over in KSW doing his thing, dominating circa 2009, 2010, 2011, somewhere in that time period, the top guys in Strikeforce were Jacare and the guy who took the title from Jacare, Luke Rockhold. So Strikeforce had always wanted to match up Mamed against Jacare or Luke Rockhold. Now, of course, that was a little bit different because they were going to bring Mamed in, have him fight a few times, and then eventually he would get a title shot, and one of those two guys would be the champion, depending on when he signed with the organization. It wasn't that clear of a line to these guys because if Mamed would have lost to someone in Strikeforce, he would have never got to fight against Rockhold or Jacare. It was more clear his path to a title or to a non-tournament, non-title super fight with the champion in Bellator. Bellator made it pretty clear what they wanted to do with him. And I've heard rumors over the years why he didn't sign with Bellator, but the reason I mentioned those guys is because I've always wanted to see those fights, and those were always fights that were rumored to possibly happen, and those were always fights that people on the internet would talk about, hey, who do you think would win this fight? Who do you think would win that fight? So I really wanted to see those fights. But the main fight that I would really like to see is Mamed Khalidov versus Gegard Mousasi. I think this is the perfect time to make this fight. And because of, like I said, if KSW and Bellator a few years ago did a cross promotion, this should have been the main event anyway. So I think that this is the perfect fight. But the next 5 fights, I definitely believe should be those 5 guys. In order of who fights who and when is irrelevant, but I think those need to be Mamed's next 5 fights. Now, why Mousasi, you might ask? What's so interesting, and what's the reason why Mousasi is worthy of fighting in the main event at KSW 100, besides being a great fighter, a recognizable name, and a former champion? What else? Well, the first reason is, for a long time, KSW was known as Polish Pride. People on the internet would look at the KSW events and say, well, this is clearly inspired by Pride. Here's a bunch of Polish guys who got together and watched a Pride FC event and clearly got inspired and decided to run their own show in the mold of Pride FC. If you looked at how their gloves looked back in the day, they used the ring just like Pride used the ring. The gloves looked similar to the Pride gloves. They had these big, well, they still do, but especially back then, they had these big entrances, and Pride had those big entrances. So there was a lot of crossover between Pride and KSW. Now, Gegard Mousasi, outside of Nick Diaz, Shinya Aoki, Hector Lombard, and maybe a few other guys, are the last remaining fighters who fought for Pride. So I think it would be a pretty cool tribute if Polish Pride, meaning KSW, would have a guy who fought in the actual Pride organization, to have him fight. I think it makes all the sense in the world to have this guy fight in the main event. That's the first reason. But the main reason why I want to see this fight is because this is the perfect fight. Like, there's no bigger fight that could be made right now for KSW or shows outside of the UFC or PFL, Bellator, outside of the United States. There's no bigger fight that could be made than this fight between Mousasi and Mamed Khalidov. What other big fights are there? Like, what other fight would you say is a fight that is better or equal to this fight that can be made? Not some dream fantasy out in left field fight that, oh, well, you know, if this guy and this promotion can come together and this and that. No. What guys are free agents that KSW could snap up to fight against Mamed Khalidov that would be a more interesting and better fight than Mousasi? I think that's really the best selling point for why this fight should take place, is because what other fight is bigger and better than that? And then you can also make the argument, all right, forget about Mamed Khalidov and Gegard Mousasi, what fights make sense for them. What fights in KSW right now are worthy of being the main event for KSW 100? They have a lot of great guys under contract. They have a lot of great champions right now in KSW. They've always had. That's the one thing that no one will tell you. KSW has always had great fighters. But what fight is bigger and better than Mamed and Gegard Mousasi? What fight, take those two guys out of it, what fight is bigger and better? You look at all the champions in KSW right now, there really aren't any bigger fights than Mamed Khalidov versus Gegard Mousasi in KSW, regardless of weight class, regardless if it's a champion fighting someone who's an outsider like Mousasi would be. Mousasi's a free agent right now. He's someone who KSW would have to sign and bring into KSW to fight at this event. Who's out there right now that's a free agent, free and clear from their former promotion? Who's available right now to be matched up with a current champion in KSW or a big name like Mamed Khalidov in KSW? The only guys are the guys I've mentioned. So that's why this fight really needs to be the main event, because it's a fight I've wanted to see for a very long time. It's two great guys finally fighting each other. It's two recognizable names fighting in a main event of a historic event, which is KSW 100. It's got an interesting story, how you have the top guy from KSW going against a guy who has been a top guy all over the world. He's been a top guy in the UFC, he's been a top guy in Strikeforce, been a top guy in Bellator, been a top guy in Dream, been a top guy wherever he's been at the top of the food chain. And Mamed Khalidov was dominating in this sport during the same exact time that Gegard Mousasi was dominating in this sport. And for whatever reason, because they weren't signed to the same promotion, they never got a chance to fight. So now's the time to have these guys fight. That's why this fight makes so much sense. Now, on a side note, not that this has anything to do with the topic we're talking about in this video, but if anyone from KSW is listening to this, can you please send me Mamed Khalidov's walkout at KSW 13? I really want to see a high quality video of that walkout. It was when he had I think they were Russian dancers, or they were Polish dancers, they were Chechnyan, I don't know exactly what they were, but they did this dance and they were wearing all black and they're wearing these big hats. I don't really know how to explain it. I don't know what style dance they were doing, but Mamed Khalidov had this big entrance at KSW 13 the first time he fought Ryuta Sakurai. He had this great walkout and they had these dancers that they brought in for the event. I think one of them might even have been a kid. I think two were adults and one was a kid. I'm not sure, because I've never seen a high quality video of this walkout. I've only seen like grainy footage of stuff that people had filmed at the event live, like filmed on a cell phone and then posted on the internet. I've never seen an HD high quality video of this walkout. So could you please post it on YouTube, or at the very least, could you just send it to me, like email it to me and let me watch it? Because, you know, I'm a very simple man. I only have a few demands. My first demand is, can you please send me that Mamed Khalidov KSW 13 walkout? And my second request is, can we make Gegard Mousasi versus Mamed Khalidov for KSW 100's main event? I'd really love to see that fight. So you've heard my opinion. You've heard what I've had to say. Now I want to hear from you. Sound off in the comment section below. Is this the fight that you want to see? Are you interested in seeing Mamed Khalidov fight against Gegard Mousasi? If not, what fight should be the main event at KSW 100? So just anything and anything, hit me up in the comment section below. Also, like this video and subscribe to my YouTube channel. And you can follow me on social media at Mike_Radich on Twitter and Instagram. And I'll talk to you guys in the next video.